This is a review video for LING 350, just some of the stuff from 220 that you should know. It might have been a while, it might have been last semester for some of you. So I just wanted to briefly touch on things. So you can just read the slides, but if you want more of a guided walkthrough and more like thoughts about my expectations, you're free to listen to this. So we're not covering this in class, and I will briefly talk about some of these when they come up in class, but there are some skills that are just really important to have that will make your life easier. So you don't have to remember this whole thing at once, but by the end of week 6 or 7, you should have a pretty good grasp on all of these concepts. So we'll talk a little bit about intonation and pitch and contour. So the idea is that when you say a sentence, with declarative sentences, usually at the very end, the pitch goes down. So that's just intonation in this sense, because intonation is giving meaning to the whole sentence. While if you have a question, normally it rises up at the end, like, where are you going? Some people in Western Canadian English, especially on TikTok or Instagram, will actually say statements with non-terminal contour, like, today we're eating here. It can go up sometimes. I'm not very good at it, but you'll hear it in the wild. So does pitch go down or up at the end of a sentence? That's terminal and non-terminal contour. Stress is like the most powerful syllable in a word. So if you think of a word like explanation, that ne is really pronounced. It's a little bit longer, it's a little bit higher pitched, it's a little bit louder than the rest. So we can either put a little accent above it, which is how we'll usually represent it, or if we're doing an IPA transcription, we can put this little thing above it. In terms of slides, sometimes these are a pain to write. So you might even just break it up into that capital letters for explanation, and then the rest would be lowercase. And if you have difficulties hearing what has primary stress, you can try to emphasize each syllable and see how it sounds. So explanation is a little weird. It's not bad, but it's not perfect. Explanation is kind of weird. Explanation is pretty weird, but explanation probably sounds the best. Now, the reason why that first syllable doesn't sound too bad is because this has secondary stress. So explanation definitely doesn't sound as explanation. And you can do this with all the other words. Typically, secondary stress will be 2 syllables away from the primary stress. But just to give you some audio for these, telegraphic, insurmountable. Okay, you should have a good grasp on the English vowels. You don't need to really know all of the formal descriptions for these, but you should at least understand patterns. So for instance, you should be able to recognize that E and I are closely related, U and that A and A, these are all low, that we have E, I, U, and as being the high vowels. So you just want to understand them in terms of their patterns, like which ones are high, which ones are low, which ones are front, which ones are back, which ones are round, and which ones are tense or lax. So the tense and lax distinction isn't going to be a huge focus. But when it comes to speech errors or acquiring sounds, we may see that some heights or depths or tensenesses or roundnesses take a little bit longer than others depending on the language. So if you don't know these, I have some example words. So beat, cleat, retreat for the E sound, bit, rift, and flipping for I, bet, threat, and det for bat, stab, and rafter for bot, father, and watch for ah. You may have a more rounded version, aw, here. It depends if you have the caught merger, or you just say caught and caught the same. Doesn't really matter. We'll just use aw. For butt, fluff, and tough. Oo for boot, shoot, and tribute. There's a little bit of a y in tribute there, so it might sound a little bit different, but that oo is still there. For book, look, and shook. And then the schwa for Canada, about, and toughen. If you can't hear the difference between the schwa and the don't worry about it. It's really not going to be a big deal for us. You should know the diphthongs too. You might have used slightly different symbols. Whatever symbols you use is fine. Some instructors use a J for the A sound, and for ow, they might use a W instead of the And for these two with O and Oi, they might have used the rounded vowel too. But as long as you can read them for bait, stay payment, about, trousers, mouse, bite, style, fly, boat, crowbar, showing, and boil, exploit, turmoil, you're fine. You might also be aware of Canadian raising, where there's a difference between ow and ow. You don't need to worry about this difference. We're not going that deep into the phonetic realizations of Canadian raising in this course. Okay, for consonants, it's a good idea to know manner, place, and voicing. I said with vowels it's more about patterns, but with these ones, when we talk generally about speech production and speech perception, we do need to know the difference between voiceless and voicing. Like, that should be very automatic for the symbols that we're familiar with. Place is going to be important too, because certain places are acquired earlier than others, depending on the language, and same with the manner. So fricatives and stops, for example, are going to be a lot easier to produce than an affricate. And affricates are not listed here, but these would be like ch and j in English, and we'll see some other ones as well. So you will have this as a reference whenever you want, but if you know them, it's going to be much faster to do any sort of data analyses or answer quiz questions. But you don't have to memorize it. You just have to have a good understanding so you can look at a table and identify very quickly what you're looking at. So with all that, you should be comfortable transcribing words. We're not really going to do much transcription itself. What's more important is just being able to read them. So you should be able to read all of these, and you should be able to look at a reading, compare it to the word that they're trying to pronounce, and see what the errors are. So just as a really simple one, if I give you the word in English, shoulder, and I say, okay, here's how a child is pronouncing it, and they say something like, hull, you should be able to identify where the errors are, what they're missing, and what they should be. So that t should be a sh, shoulder. I mean, I guess that is kind of okay. Maybe an o, like a shortened o might be better for shoulder, and then of course the r at the end. If you use an upside down r or a top side up r, I don't care. This isn't a phonetics course. Okay, we will touch briefly on syllables. So you might not have done this in LING 220. I think there's one offering that didn't cover it. Essentially, a syllable peaks around a vowel, so every single vowel in a word, like let's say we have the word heater. Every single vowel is going to be its own syllable, which we do with the sigma symbol. This is sigma here. It starts with an S, syllable starts with an S. Fantastic. And basically, we take a look to the left and we try to fill it up with all of the valid possible inputs. So he and t are forming their own syllables. And then when we have consonants strangling on the right, we include them. So what we get is two syllables, he and ter. And if we want to really simplify this, we can just break it down into consonants and vowels. Like this is called a CV, CVC word. So there's a CV syllable because it's consonant vowel, and then a CVC syllable because it's consonant vowel consonant. And certain syllable combinations are easier to acquire than others, and they come at different stages. So being able to do this is really helpful. There will be times when I can help you with this. But if you can do it on your own, that just makes things a little bit faster. And if you take phonology in the future, it's a very useful skill. Okay. We will talk about minimal pairs very briefly. We're not doing any data sets where we're finding minimal pairs or allophones. We just really need to understand what they are. So when we talk about experiments or results that look at minimal pairs or look at allophones or look at cues for learning those, we know what they are. We know what we're trying to convey. So when two words differ exactly with one sound and have different meanings, then we have minimal pairs. So with the words run and done, everything is the same except for the R and the D here, so we say that they're separate phonemes. In other words, we perceive them as different sounds. Swim and slim, same thing. The only difference is the W and the L, so W and L, we perceive them as different sounds. Okay, so our brain has organized them and said these contribute to the word, and they will be different if we change the W for an L in a word. Allophones are a little bit different. Allophones have different variations, so it's like we want to say the letter N, but we pronounce it in a couple different ways. Like before interdentals, it's pronounced more against your teeth, so tenth. that N is being pronounced against the back of your top teeth, while in tent, that N is being pronounced more closely to the T right on the alveolar ridge. So these happen in exclusive environments. In other words, you always get the dental ends before the interdentals. You get the regular ends before the alveolars. You're not going to get them where they swap. So we won't do data sets, but just know that allophones are like different ways of pronouncing the same sound, and speakers don't really hear a difference between them. If you're not trained in linguistics, you will not know that you are pronouncing different sounds. Okay, so that's going to be important for speech perception, because how does a child know that two different pronunciations, like this dental N and this alveolar N, are supposed to be interpreted as the same sound? While in other languages, that might not be the case. They might be different sounds. So that's where the understanding of allophones is quite important. Okay, some phonological processes we'll be talking about in terms of speech errors. So there's 5 common ones that we'll see. We'll introduce more specific words for other types of processes, but the words aren't really important. It's more about describing what's happening, like saying this sound changes to this. Like, okay, that's good enough. Just to briefly touch on these, assimilation is when two sounds become more alike. So let's say we have an S, or let's change this. Let's say a G followed by an S. These differ in voicing. The second one, S, is voiceless. The first one is voiced. So what someone might do to make this easier to pronounce is change the S to a Z. So in other words, the Z is now voiced, so these are more the same. In other words, one property is becoming more like the property of another sound. So that's more like assimilation. With dissimilation, it would be exactly the opposite. So that'd be like GZ to GS, where the voiced pair is becoming a voiced and voiceless pair. That's not really a realistic example. It's hard to find one that is useful in English. I guess one example would be the word fifths. Some people have difficulties with the fact that we have 3 fricatives back to back. So what people do is they change this into a stop to make it a little bit easier to pronounce. So you end up getting something like fifths. Not a lot of people do this, but it's common enough that, especially in children, you would hear this type of pattern. So this is dissimilation, sounds becoming different. In other words, all of these are fricatives. So we break up the fricative chain by making one sound, the middle sound in this case, less similar. Okay, deletion is removing a sound. So some people, even with the word fifths, they might even just completely remove that second F and just say something like fifths, fifths, fifths. So because you're seeing that in isolation, you might say, wow, that's weird. But in a sentence, you probably wouldn't notice that someone is saying that they were like in the fifth something. Okay, but that's an example of deletion. You're removing a sound. Epenthesis is adding a sound. Spanish is a good example of this. If they try to pronounce the English word ski, usually that A comes up front, so they can break it into 2 syllables, esquí. In terms of English, there are some difficult transitions where you may add a schwa or an I in there, or even another sound. Like, for example, in the word something. Some people, what they'll do is they'll add a P between that M and that th, just to make the transition easier. So something versus something. So that's epenthesis, which is adding a sound. And metathesis is swapping sounds. So the classic example would be spaghetti and pischetti, or foliage and foliage. Sometimes it's just a reading error. Other times it's just hard to read. Not hard to read, hard to pronounce. So I guess another one would be like the word prescription. Prescription. A lot of people say prescription, not prescription. So that's an example of metathesis. Okay, in the syntax unit, we should probably know what grammaticality is. So remember, we are not prescribing judgments. We are just observing speech. And if speakers of a certain language or community accept it as a possible sentence, then it's grammatical. So I don't want to believe that Fido was stealing my magazines. That's perfect for any dialect of English in North America. The one which the with scooter ran the park towards is definitely not okay. And then in certain dialects, you would get, I ain't wanting none of them people near me, you hear, and that'd be fine. But for other people in other dialects of English, it would not be okay. So we'll stick more to the traditional examples, but just be aware that there might be a paper or two where we might talk about communities where we get these different types of sentences that are grammatical to them, but maybe not to you. Okay. You should know the basic word categories as well, like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and prepositions, because those are words that we acquire. They're content words. So I won't go too deep into this, but nouns are people, places, or things. They occur after the words the and a. Adjectives describe nouns. They typically occur before our nouns. Verbs are going to be your actions, sensations, or states. You can inflect them with past tense or third person. So if you have if you have a sentence, let's use a sentence instead, and says he versus I, and then you have a verb here, the form of the verb will change depending on whether you have he or I. So it would be he verbs or I verb. So there's like no S at the end. So that's how you can tell there's a verb very easily. You try to put it after he or I and see if the form changes. Adverbs describe verbs or sentences. So typically we think of them as describing verbs. So the quickest hit, sneakily crept, solemnly cried. I don't know. When would you use the word solemnly? It's not a common word for me anyway. Or they modify sentences. So quickly they ran, or they quickly ran, or they ran quickly. One of the biggest hints of an adverb is that you can move it around. So if it can occur at the beginning, normally it can occur at the end. There are some cases like yesterday where they can't appear beside the verb, but they do have that movement property. And finally, prepositions. These always introduce noun phrases, NPs. If you took syntax 322, you can call them DPs. We're going to be pretty neutral. NP, DP, either is fine. They usually have something to do with location, time, or duration, but they have so many different meanings that it's kind of hard to classify them. So the key is that they're introducing a noun phrase or determiner phrase, depending on what you want to call it. Okay, so those are really the only important categories that we'll be seeing a lot of. And we'll use those to learn about how constituents are formed, which words come first, and so on. We will talk a little bit about some other functional words, but they're not going to be a huge focus. So remember, a constituent is just a phrase. So it's any word or group of words that function as a unit. So in this case of my sister buys a book, my is a constituent, sister is, buys is, and book is. So each of the words individually are constituents. A book is an object, it's a thing, that's also a constituent. Buys a book is a predicate, it's a constituent. My sister is a subject, that's a constituent. And then the entire sentence itself is a constituent. So if you want to think about it in terms of tree structures, every single node on a tree forms its own constituent with everything below it. But what you really just need to know is that this is like a group of words that forms a phrase. Some other word categories that will be mentioned but aren't as important are conjunctions. So these combine two phrases of the same type. You can remember them with fanboys, for and nor, but, or, yet, so. Typically we just use and, or, but. We might talk about nor because it's a little bit more complicated, but yet, so, and for as conjunctions are less common nowadays. So these take two phrases of the same type and join them together. So with the tortoise and the hare is a noun phrase, the hare is a noun phrase. So we can use a conjunction to make them into a bigger noun phrase. Same with two prepositional phrases, at night, in the morning. We can combine them with the conjunction or to make at night or in the morning. Basically takes two phrases of the same type and builds them into a bigger phrase. If you did X-bar theory in 322, you might have treated them a little bit differently. If you did binary branching structure, don't worry about it, we're not doing structure. Modals are words that appear under tense. So these have knowledge meanings, permissibility meanings, and ability meanings. I don't know if we'll talk about it or not. I haven't decided yet because modals can get quite tricky and philosophers have very, very interesting opinions on them that might not match the language acquisition research. And there's a lot of cognitive science students in here and I don't want to ruffle any feathers. So we might talk about them, we might not. But they're modals. There's 9 of them. You can remember them just off the list. And in structures, we'd call them T. But again, we don't care about the structure too much. They're just modals. Auxiliaries will be important for morpheme acquisition as well as syntactic structures. We don't really need to be able to identify them. We just need to be able to understand what they do, essentially. So these are supporting verbs or supporting words that help give more information about whether a verb is complete or not, whether it's ongoing or not, or whether the focus of the sentence should be on the subject or the object. So we have the progressive. This is your be plus ing forms. So is running, are running, am running. This says when an event is continuous or not. We have the perfective auxiliary, which tells us if an event has been completed. So this is your have plus an ed. So have jumped, have run. I say ed here, but of course it's really just a participle form, so it might be irregular as well. Ed, en, or irregular. And then for the passive auxiliary, which focuses the object, like the asteroid was hit, Jupiter was hit, then you have your be, and then you have your ed, en, irregular ending as well. So there's like a nice little combination here where the ing goes with be, and then the ed goes with have or be, and depending on which one it's with, it has a different meaning. And you can string these all along. So had been running, for example. Okay, when we get into more complicated sentence types, really all we need to know are complement clauses and complementizers. So complementizers, the words we'll look at now are if, that, and whether, and what they do is they introduce a sentence after them. So Ernie will ask for treats is a sentence. So when we say that Ernie will ask for treats, that is introducing a sentence. If you are watching me, so you are watching me is a sentence. If is introducing that sentence, so it's a complementizer. Typically, they come after verbs. It's basically saying, I want the sentence that follows after to be the object of the verb. Okay, that's what a complementizer does, but it can also occur in the subject position, like whether people lost their hair from stress concerns me. But again, we'll see these in context a lot and we'll explain them explicitly, but just be aware that these categories exist, and what complementizers do is they introduce sentences, or if we want to be really formal with the 322 syntax, TPs. Okay, passivization is another one of these structures that children will acquire, and in other languages they'll acquire antipassives, causatives, and object incorporation as well, but just passivization for now. This is basically a sentence transformation where we either remove an argument or add an argument to change the sentence around and put the focus on something else. So the meaning doesn't change, but the focus does. So in the worker built the coffin, we say there's a builder and there's something that is built. But we can transform it into the passive and focus on the thing being built, and we can say the coffin was built. So we're not really caring about who built the coffin anymore. We're not mentioning the worker. So we're demoting the worker. We're getting rid of that agent. That's what we call it. The person who does the action is the agent. And then we're just keeping the theme. We can introduce the agent back in a by phrase. So for an example, an asteroid hit Jupiter. Asteroid is the hitter. Jupiter is the thing being hit. We can instead focus the object, so Jupiter was hit, but we can put that agent back in and just say Jupiter was hit by an asteroid. But the goal of passivization is really just to say the most important thing that I'm talking about right now in this sentence is the object. Okay, there's two types of ambiguity. So children learn words and children learn structures, and they have to figure out what you're trying to say when words sound the same or when sentences sound the same. So lexical ambiguity is at the word level. So it's a word that has multiple meanings. So my bat is one of the best things in the world. This could be a baseball bat or it could be a flying bat. Context helps. Another example would be we'll just leave this at the bank and then head out. So this is bank, like a bank that you would go deposit money at, or maybe you're leaving a body somewhere. Structural ambiguity is when the structure leads to different interpretations. So young men and women dominate the company. Here's the question. Is young describing both men and women? Or is young just describing men and then any type of woman? So that's an example of structural ambiguity. To represent this, we basically say, is it adj attaching to n plus n, or is it adj n, and then we're adding n to it afterwards. Another example would be Jake decided on the boat. So you can do the action of deciding while you're on the boat, or you can say decide on the boat. In other words, to say that Jake chose the boat. So if you use it as a phrasal verb, your meaning is chose, while if you say verb prepositional phrase, you're really giving a location for where the decision was happening. Okay, there is scope ambiguity, but we're not going to see that with kids. We may talk about contradictions, so I might as well include them. Contradictions are basically statements that are always false. So if you say I am a married man and I am a bachelor, that can't be true. You're contradicting yourself because someone who's married is not a bachelor and someone who's a bachelor is not married. They conflict. Or I am an only child and I love my sister. Well, if you're an only child, you don't have any siblings, so you can't love your sister. And if you love your sister, then you can't be an only child because you have a sibling. So when you combine them and you say A and B together, it'll always be false. That's a contradiction. Okay. For morpheme acquisition, we need to know what morphemes are. So morphemes are minimal units of meaning. So these can be simple words, or they can be these bound morphemes that attach to words to make them bigger. Words do have structure. That's not going to be a main focus, but you should just be aware that words, more complex words, are built from simple words. And one of those processes is using affixes. So we have prefixes, where say we have a root verb, then we attach something on the left of it. So we attach a prefix to the left. If we have a root and we attach something to the right of it, then we have a suffix. So there are some examples there. In non-English, what you might see are what are called infixes. This is when you have a root word, and then you're putting something inside of it. So in the case of like Billy in Tagalog, what you're doing is you're inserting something right after that first sound. And that is what's called an infix. So this thing is acting as a root. So because we're going inside of that root, inside of that base form, it's an infix. Circumfixes go around. They're kind of like headphones in a way. They're headphones that go over the root. You need a left headphone and a right headphone. So if adil is fair, then ke adalan is fairness, and this ke and on join together at the same time. This is your headphone. You can't have them independently. They must join together, and together they contribute one meaning. So you can imagine a circumfix might be harder to learn because you might think of it as a prefix and a suffix as separate things. You might play around and try them as prefixes and suffixes until then later you learn they have to always appear together. Okay, inflectional morphemes. When we talk about morpheme acquisition, we're going to focus mostly on the order of inflectional morphemes. So these are grammatical morphemes. So things like the plural, the genitive, on nouns, the third person singular, present participle, the progressive, past tense and past participle, or perfective on verbs, and on adjectives and adverbs, the comparative and superlative. So we will use some abbreviations for these. PL for plural, gen or pos for the possessive. Third person singular is 3PS. The present participle, usually we write this as progressive. Past tense, we just write this as past. The past participle, we might write this as perf, or we would write this as past, depending on whether or not it's a perfect or passive. And then for the comparative and superlative, to be honest, we don't really care too much about these, but it is interesting to see how children start to compare things and start to pick out something out of a group as being like the most of something. But we don't really see these too often in our glosses. In terms of derivational morphemes, in English, it's everything else. Inflection is grammatical. Derivational creates new word categories or new meanings. There's tons and tons of these in many languages, so we don't learn these. Typically, we just learn the inflections, and then we understand that the rest are derivational. If you take morphology, if you take LING 323, you get a much more nuanced discussion of inflection versus derivation. We're not going to worry about that in this course. We'll just take a pretty black and white approach, and I'll make it pretty obvious whether or not something is inflectional or derivational. Finally, two more things. Some more word processes. We saw affixation. There is compounding where you take two words and put them together, but there's also changes that happen inside a word. So there could be vowel changes, like sing to sang, where that middle sound, that is an S, and goes to a to make sing and sang. It could be a tone change. So here we just use these little symbols up and down for high and low tones. and maybe the tones are going to change when you want a slightly different meaning. It could be that the stress moves. I mean, anything to do with an individual sound at the sound level or above in terms of prosody could be an example of internal change. Suppletion and partial suppletion are when words undergo an internal change, but they're less predictable. So partial suppletion is when part of a word changes. So when you think of partial suppletion, you should think of the word think and thought. So you think something or you thought something. There's still like a little bit of that word that retains itself, that part in the beginning, that makes it partial suppletion. But if you didn't know this pair, you wouldn't be able to predict this. We don't have like bink and bought, for example. It's a close pair, but it's not close enough that people would guess that this is how you would say it. Think and thinked would be more reasonable if you didn't know English. Full suppletion is when it's completely unpredictable. So for example, go and went. There's no way that you're figuring out what the word went is just from the word go. This is something you have to learn. Other languages do this all the time. It's a bit of a pain to learn if you're learning other languages, but these are just things you have to memorize. Okay, so that is the full video for the things that you should know. I talked fast, I went through things quickly, but again, like, it's just about being exposed to this and being comfortable with it. So you don't need to be able to do full problem sets with these. You just need to be able to identify what you're looking at, like word category, is something a constituent or not? What sounds are we looking at? What are the commonalities across the sounds? What are the morphemes that we're looking at? A lot of it I am giving to you in the data set or in a quiz, or I'm telling you what these things are and you're just reasoning about them. But there may be some times where being able to do these quickly on your own without references might be beneficial for the sake of time and will also help you in other courses. So that's it for the video, and I'll see you in class.